Okay, this video will be the beginning of your burlap embroidery project. We're going to start by tracing a shape onto our burlap. In this assignment we're doing a tree. Could be a Christmas tree or any other kind of evergreen. So we'll trace around the template and that'll give us a line for our stitching. So in this first video, we'll just learn how to do the back stitch for outlining. So the outline that we just drew is going to get completely traced in back stitch. So I have my scissors if I need to cut my yarn, a piece of yarn to stitch with, and a tapestry needle. When you thread your needle, you just put the end of the yarn into the needle, pull through a little bit, okay? And then on the long end, you're gonna tie your knot. Don't tie it too tight, leave your knot so it's kind of big so you can visibly see the knot in the yarn. You might even tie like 2 knots if you're worried about it pulling through. So I have my knot, and then I'm gonna start on the back in the corner. So I want my knot to be hidden, so my knot is gonna go underneath. So I'm gonna come up from the back, right on my outline, and pull it through until I feel the knot catch on the back. Okay, for back stitch, we're gonna come up in front of where we want the stitch to go and then stitch backwards to fill it in. So I'm gonna go down into the burlap and pull that through. Tangled up. Okay, so for my first back stitch, I'm going to come up in front of where I want the stitch to go, pull my yarn all the way through, and then go backwards to the end of the stitch I just made. So I'm coming up from underneath, pull my yarn all the way through, go backwards to the end of the previous stitch, come up in front of where I want the stitch to go, and then go backwards to make the other end of my stitch. Your stitches need to be small and neat, and it should be a solid line, no space in between. So when I come up, I'm just coming up. If you look, there's the end of the previous stitch. Here's my needle. So my next stitch is just going to be that big. They shouldn't be big enough to get a pencil through. They need to be even, and when you're pulling through, make sure you're pulling through with even tension. So you'll just keep stitching. So you come up in front of where you want the stitch to go, and then go backwards to the end. Come up in front of where you want the stitch to go, and then go backwards to finish the stitch. And you'll just keep stitching around the whole outline, up in front of where you want the stitch to go, and then stitch backwards. There are 11 total embroidery stitches, and then lots of variations on those stitches. We'll just be learning 3. So today we are learning back stitch. Tomorrow, in the next video, we'll cover running stitch. And then in the third video, we'll cover satin stitch. And those will be the 3 stitches you need to finish your entire embroidery project. So this is embroidery. It's embroidery, it's decorative. This is not sewing. Sewing is what we do when we're stitching 2 pieces of cloth together. This is not functional, it's not purpose, it's just decorative. So that makes it embroidery, not sewing. You could also say stitching, and stitching could apply to either sewing or embroidery. Anything you would do with a needle and thread can be called stitching in a general way, but this is not sewing. This is embroidery, and it's important, I think it's important, to be specific in our terminology. So we are embroidering on burlap. We're embroidering with yarn, and we're using a needle to make the stitches. So when I get to the end of my yarn, and I want to leave myself some extra, I don't want to stitch too close to the end of my yarn. So here's my last stitch on this yarn. So when I get to the end, I've made my last stitch. I'm going to flip it over. So here's the surface of the back. I'm going to take my needle and make a loop. Okay, so my yarn is a loop around my finger. Then I'm going to take my needle and go through that loop, and then pull that all the way down to make a knot. And then I'm going to leave that tail for now. If you're stitching at home and you're not sure how to do the knot, re-watch that a couple times. If you really can't get it, just pull your needle out, leave that, and I'll help you tie it the next time I see you. So I'm ready for another piece of yarn to continue around my outline. So same thing, I'm going to thread my needle and tie a knot in the end. And you're just going to keep back stitching. And where you come up in front of where you want the stitch to go, and then stitch backwards. Come up in front of where you want the stitch to go, and then go backwards. So my next stitch is going to go right there. I'm going to come up in front of where I want the stitch to go, and then stitch backwards. So you will continue all the way around the outline until you have the entire tree shape outlined in backstitch.